All right, now that we are done looking at the opening decade and a half of the Cold War, it's time to switch gears and start looking at the United States. This video is going to cover the political issues during the administrations of Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. There is a separate video on something called the Red Scare, which is another politically involved issue during the 1940s and 50s. But here we're just looking at the two presidents. All right, at the end of World War II, the biggest fear among the American people was a return to the Great Depression. It was World War II that had pulled the United States out of the Great Depression. And so as the war drew to a close, our biggest fear wasn't Cold War, it wasn't nuclear war, it was a return to the Depression. With that in mind, Congress passed this bill called the GI Bill of Rights. Its official name is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, but you probably have heard of it as the GI Bill. The GI Bill is best known for giving veterans money to go to college. But it does so much more than that, especially in the aftermath of World War II. It provided veterans with low-interest loans so they could buy a home. It also provided veterans with low-interest loans, low-interest business loans, so they could start or expand a business. And part of this was a thank you to the veterans for what they had done in World War II, which is nothing short of saving the world. But part of it was also to keep the veterans out of the labor market, to delay their entry into the labor market. Okay? If they're busy going to school, which they might not have been able to afford, rather than trying to find work, they won't be unemployed. Those that aren't going to go back to school, if they want to start their own business, they are creating jobs, not looking for jobs. So there was an economic component to this bill. And so it keeps people out of the labor market, and then it also provided economic opportunity. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, there were economic problems. One of the things that Congress very quickly did at the end of World War II, kind of over the objections of the administration, was to remove wartime price controls. When you study economics, you have to study this concept of supply and demand. When the supply is low, the price of a good will tend to rise. Well, during World War II, the supplies of civilian products were limited, and theoretically, the market would have allowed those prices to go up. Well, Congress had put restrictions on that and established price ceilings. The price could not go above certain levels. But that is seen as a restriction on capitalism, so Congress tried to remove that as quickly as possible. Now, what ended up happening was prices went up. And between 1946 and 1947, there was 33% inflation, which is huge, especially when you look at the overall inflation rate in the United States, which averages right around 3% for the history of the United States. Every year, prices go up about 3%. Also, during World War II, unions had, in order to look more patriotic and not slow down the war effort, unions had put off strikes. They didn't go on strike during World War II. That changes now that the war is over, and in the spring of 1946, over 4 million workers in different industries are going to go on strike. And while some of these strikes were successful, and they did get some concessions, and labor union membership did increase, there were people who felt that the unions had gone too far, especially in situations where they gained concessions and then continued to strike anyway. One of the groups that people thought were going too far were the railroad workers. In May of 1946, railroad workers went on strike, and President Truman helped negotiate an agreement between the union and the businesses. The union then continued to go on strike, saying, we've decided we want more. Truman went to Congress and threatened to draft the striking workers. He went to Congress to ask for authorization to draft them into the military. While he was giving that speech, the Union sent him a note saying they were willing to abide by the agreement that had already been made. Now, Truman was satisfied with that. Congress was not. Congress ended up passing a law. This is a Republican-dominated Congress, by the way. Congress ended up passing a law called the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act did a number of things. Some of the big things was it outlawed the closed shop. The closed shop was a business where the Union had gotten the business to agree to this. Any new hire had to join the Union before they could go on the payroll. And so Congress outlawed that. They also, this law also restricted the use of the strike and several other different union activities. Prior to this law, individual workers in the business who were not union members still had union dues taken out of their paychecks. And so Congress tried to restrict labor union activities with this law. Now, Truman vetoed the bill. But even though he vetoed it, there was enough support for this in Congress that the Congress was able to override the veto. This requires a 2/3 majority in the House and a 2/3 majority in the Senate to override a presidential veto. So this was a hugely popular bill, at least among Congress. Now, Truman, while he is president, he is also going to attempt to advance the cause of civil rights. He put together something called the Presidential Commission on Civil Rights, which investigated the condition of African Americans in the country and then made recommendations. One of the things that they recommended was expanding the civil rights section within the Justice Department and instead expanding it into the Civil Rights Division, which it is now. What this means is that there would be more investigators and lawyers in that department, specifically looking at whether or not people's civil rights were being violated. It also recommended that a wartime agency, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, be made permanent. This commission that could, investigate potential civil rights abuses by employers. One of the big things that Truman did was he issued something called Executive Order 9981. No one ever remembers the title. They just remember what it did. He issues this in July of 1948, and what it did was it desegregated the armed forces. FDR had made the first steps in the desegregation of the military by requiring the military bases to be integrated. But still, the military was segregated. You had black units, you had white units. Black soldiers could not command white soldiers. Truman's executive order does away with that and allows African Americans to advance through the ranks and end up in command positions. This is a hugely important thing, and Truman didn't obviously have to do it. But it's important to notice the date. 1948. Because 1948 is also an election year. And Truman is up for re-election. And desegregating the armed forces in 1948 could play a role in this election. In fact, he had been warned that if he desegregated the armed forces before the election, he would probably lose. And Truman said, if it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do. In the election of 1948, the Republicans nominated this guy, Thomas Dewey. Maybe you remember that he ran for president in 1944, but he was really trying to run for president in 1948, so he'd been planning this for 4 years. And he was very popular. People around the country knew his name. The Democrats nominated Truman. He's the sitting president. He deserves another shot here at another term. However, not all the Democrats are happy. And what ended up happening after the main Democratic Party renominated Truman, the people in the party who opposed him split. They left the party. One group decided to name themselves the Progressive Party. They nominated a former vice president, Franklin Roosevelt's vice president from his third term, actually, a guy named Henry Wallace. This political party would be acceptable to the Communist Party of the United States. In fact, there were several people that had communist leanings who campaigned for the Progressive Party. This group said the reason they were upset with Truman is they said that he was too tough on communism, that he was starting the whole Cold War, that the Soviet Union had nothing to do with it, that it was all America's fault. The other group that broke away from the Democrats called themselves the States' Rights Party, and many times you will see them referred to as the Dixiecrats. They nominated this guy, Strom Thurmond, for president. He was a senator from South Carolina, and their biggest concern with Truman was that he was in favor of civil rights. These are obviously going to be the Democrats from the South, and they were opposed to his positions on civil rights. They wanted to roll back his desegregation of the military and some of the things that they saw as giving African Americans more rights. So the Democrats not only split into two parties, but into three parties, which is going to make it that much more difficult for Truman to win re-election. In campaigning in 1948, Thomas Dewey, the Republican, really did not run a very effective campaign. He gave speeches that were rather empty. He didn't touch on any major issues out of fear that he might make someone mad and, lose votes out of it. Truman, on the other hand, is going to go across the country giving speech after speech after speech. Some people refer to these as the give 'em hell speeches, because Truman was not what we would call now politically correct. At one point, he was giving a speech and he said, well, the people that believe this, they're just full of a bunch of manure. Which, if you don't know what that is, that's cow poop. And someone looked at Harry Truman's wife, and they said, you must be so embarrassed that he would say something like that out loud. And Bess Truman replied with, or do you have any idea how long it's taken me to get him to use the word manure? Because otherwise he would have used something completely different, which is not appropriate for a school video. In his give 'em hell speeches, he would often refer to the 80th Congress, which was the Republican-dominated Congress, as the Do-Nothing Congress. He called them this because, in his mind, they were not following along with his vision for how America needed to be. He wanted to continue the progress of the New Deal that FDR had started, and Congress was standing in the way of that. Now, despite all the speeches, despite everything that you've just heard, most everyone in America still predicted a Thomas Dewey victory. In fact, this political cartoon ran at some point. You see, polls showed that Dewey was going to run away with it. Okay? That it was going to be a landslide for Dewey. And that Truman, it was all over. But, partly because of his speech making, and partly because of those groups that left the Democratic Party, Truman was able to win the election. And this is probably one of the more famous political photographs ever taken. Truman was in Chicago for his, on the night of the election, and the Chicago Tribune had many newspapers. After the early results came in from the East Coast, they did the math and they went, well, yeah, as long as Truman doesn't run the table and win everything out west, it's going to be a Dewey victory. And so they printed their newspapers. The Chicago Tribune was one of them. Instead, Truman did run the table out west, and he did pick up the victory. And part of the reason the split of the Democratic Party helped him was because as a politician, you have to keep everybody in your party happy. So Truman was going to have to keep the more communist elements of the Democratic Party happy. He was going to have to keep the segregationist elements of the Democratic Party happy. Well, once those two groups left, he could focus on the middle of the party. And it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, typically the middle involves everybody, people of both parties. And so he wasn't just talking to the middle of the Democrats, he was talking to the middle of America. And that's an important detail to know. Now, after he got reelected, he started what he called the fair deal, Truman's domestic agenda. You might want to watch out on a test. You might see, which president came up with, and you might have the New Deal, FDR, the fair deal, Truman. They might refer back to the square deal, which was Theodore Roosevelt. But this was Truman's domestic agenda, the fair deal. And what he wanted to do, Congress would, in fact, increase minimum wage to 75 cents an hour. What a time to be alive, right? They would also expand Social Security coverage, covering more people under Social Security and providing more benefits to the people. They would also pass something called the Housing Act of 1949. It was government-financed low-income housing. After World War II, there was a recognition that people needed higher standards of living in the United States. And this was a recognition that some people could not afford it. And so, with this Housing Act of 1949, the government actually helped finance the building of 800,000 housing units for low-income households. Now, Truman had in his mind other goals. One of them was going to be civil rights legislation. But Congress stood in the way. Part of that was Republican obstruction because, well, he's a Democrat, they're Republicans. Of course, they're going to try to get in the way. But also, many of the leaders in Congress were Southern Democrats who were opposed to that civil rights legislation, and they would stand in the way of that. Now, ultimately, what Truman wanted to do here in America, we tend to forget about it, and it's overshadowed by the events of the Cold War. But we shouldn't forget that he did do these things. Now, in 1952, we have another election. This election, we're just going to talk about the Republicans because the Democrats take a lot of the blame for the failures of the Cold War. Those you've seen before. One of those is the fall of China, the start of the Korean War, and the fact that it was stalemated by this point, the Soviet Union getting the atomic bomb. Democrats take the blame for that because Truman is in charge of the country when it happens. The Republicans in 1952 are going to nominate Dwight Eisenhower, the guy who won World War II. The Republicans were able to get him to run for president in 1952. The Democrats, actually, some Democrats had gone to him in 1948, trying to get him to run against Truman in the primaries. But he is going to be the Republican nominee. The Democrats actually, in 1952, are going to try to trace down a rumor that while he was in Europe, Eisenhower had had an affair with the British woman who had been his driver while he was in Britain. And this is true, he had. And he had written a letter to then Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, who at this point was the Secretary of State. And he had told Marshall that, hey, I've fallen in love with this woman. I'm going to divorce my wife and marry her. Marshall told him not to, that it would cause such a scandal that it would ruin his career. In fact, Marshall would have him thrown out of the army. So Eisenhower didn't. He led the rest of World War II. But this is a rumor. And the Democrats were going to try to track it down. Harry Truman, President Truman, called George Marshall, his Secretary of State, who had been in charge of the military during World War II, and told him to find the letter and destroy it. Truman did not believe people's personal lives needed to be brought up in the political arena. And so Marshall destroyed the letter, even though obviously we know that it existed, but that was kept out of the campaign by Truman. You gotta give Truman credit for being a stand-up guy. Now, for vice president, the Republicans nominated Richard Nixon. He's mentioned a couple times, depending on what order you've watched these videos in. Richard Nixon had kind of made a household name for himself because he was tough on communism. He had been in Congress and he had been prosecuting alleged communists in the government during this period called the Red Scare, which you may or may not have already seen those notes. And so that's why he was selected as vice president. Now, you might think that's an odd picture for me to pick, but I picked it for an important reason. Nixon, after he was chosen to be Eisenhower's vice president, was actually almost kicked off the ticket. Because after he's chosen to be vice president, before the election happens, there were allegations made that he had abused his campaign finances, that people had given him money for his campaign, and he had turned around and used it for his personal life, for his family. Nixon is able to save his political career by going on television and giving this thing called the Checkers speech. He's holding checkers in that picture. What he did in this speech is he said, there is nothing that I have ever done that is illegal. Everything I have done has always been above the board. I am not a crook. And then he stopped and said, wait. I do have to admit, at one campaign event, someone gave me this dog, this puppy, named Checkers. And when my daughters saw the puppy, they fell in love with Checkers, and I couldn't say no and give the dog back, and Checkers became a part of our family. If anyone has given me anything that I used inappropriately, it has been Checkers. Oh, well, the American public just ate it all up. We loved it. And that kept him on the ticket and kept him as Eisenhower's vice president, then for the next 2 terms. Okay. You'll notice in this map, there's a reason I bring it up, the South is always called the Solid South, because the South always votes Democrat. Well, you'll see in this election, Texas and a couple others actually voted Republican. You very rarely see that. Now, this area right in here, this is the Deep South. This is pretty much always going to vote Democrat. Right? But still, you have some Democrats who turned. The governor of Texas actually was a Democrat. And in 1952, he said the people of Texas, the Democrats of Texas, needed to vote for Eisenhower. Right? Now, stuff that goes on in the country while Eisenhower is president, probably the biggest thing is the passage of something called the Interstate Highway Act. It has a couple different names it's known by. You might see it as the Eisenhower Transportation Act, or you might see it as the Federal Highway Act. Either way, when you see highways or interstate highways, think of the interstate highway system. Congress approves over $25 billion, and they have since added to it to build over 41,000 miles of interstate highways. And it's this huge sum of money. This is the largest single public works project in U.S. history. It dwarfs all others. The creation of these highways, and there's even more than have been since this map was created. This is actually part of the reason they got Congress to pass it was billed as being necessary for national defense. This is part of the Cold War. See, these highways are necessary because what if we have to move troops around the country? During World War I, the military had tried to demonstrate the need for interstate highways. And during World War I, they took 40,000 troops that were stationed in California, and they said, your mission for the war is to drive from California to the East Coast. 40,000 troops headed out from California across the continent. It took them 40 days to get from one end of the country to the other. And after World War I, the military had said, look, this is how long it takes. We need interstate highways, because at that point, even federal roads, anytime they got to a town, they still had a stop sign. And so every time a military vehicle came to an intersection, it had to stop. A young lieutenant in World War I on that trip was Dwight Eisenhower. And so, since we're fighting the Cold War, we might need to move troops across country. They need to be on roads where they don't have to stop. Now, an unintentional consequence of the Highway Act is it's also going to benefit the U.S. economy as people are able to move around easier. This wasn't just for the military to use. This was for everyone. Other things they'll do during Eisenhower's administration, again, just like with Truman, they'll expand Social Security coverage. These are the good times. And so in the good times, we can pay to take care of more and more people. They also increased minimum wage to $1 per hour. Now, I will skip Eisenhower's re-election in 1956, but just know that that happened. I'm going to come to the end, 1960, after Eisenhower has served his 2 terms. As Eisenhower prepares to leave office, he gives his farewell address, as all presidents do, and he warns America against something that he called the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex. I'll explain it this way, and then I have a graphic. But what Eisenhower says is there is this cozy relationship that exists between the defense industries and the military. You see, the defense industries, they are constantly coming up with new equipment, new weapons, whatever, and they're trying to sell it to the military. And so they will send people to the military saying, you need this, you really need to buy it. The military then goes to Congress to get the money, and the military tells Congress, look, we need this new weapon. It's important. Congress then, of course, approves the money, and it's bought. The defense industry makes money. The military gets what it needs. And then the people in the military, the generals, the admirals, the people that are in charge, as they retire, they go to work for the defense industries, not developing new technologies, but becoming lobbyists, going to Congress, but also going back to their old friends in the military, telling them about the new products and convincing them that the military needs to buy it. So imagine your old commanding officer, who you've been trained to follow and obey, coming to you and saying, you need to buy this product. Well, of course you are trained to obey, but you also have loyalty to them. And if you buy their product, then when you retire, you can get the same kind of job they now have, making more money. And that's what he's talking about, the dangers of the military-industrial complex. What he was saying was, we are spending money on things we don't actually need because of this relationship. And like I said, here's this graphic. And it's exactly what I've told you it is. The weapons producers. Okay? Going to Congress, lobbying Congress. But also lobbying the Pentagon and the Defense Department, who then has the revolving door. People going from the Pentagon to the defense industries. Okay? All this being involved to make sure that the weapons producers make money. That's what he's warning against. Thus ends the politics of the post-war era.